Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Took. I am a vice president and senior smart building consultant with DB Engineering. This group really appreciates you tuning in today for the Smart Building Exchange. This group is going to be talking about choosing the smart building platform that is right for you. To lay the foundation of today's conversation, give you an idea of how this is going to go. I'm going to go through a quick presentation just to set the stage. If for any of you that are on, if you have any questions that you'd like any of the panelists to address, we'll have a session at the end of this. If you would please enter any questions that you have into the Q&A panel. We'll be taking a look at that. We've got some folks on the back end, and then we can address some of those at the end of the discussion. Once I go through this brief presentation to set the stage, we'll introduce all of the panelists, and then we'll get into a very active, moderated discussion. So to kick things off, I am going to share my screen. Trevor, you want to do me a favor? Let me know if you see it. Good deal. All right, everyone. So choosing the smart building platform that is right for you. For just about everyone that's on the panel today, we've spent years of our careers working with real estate companies, whether it's large corporate enterprises or as owner landlords on just a wide array of smart building projects. And oftentimes what this group hears from our customers is that we want a smart building platform. Not really any rhyme or reason behind it. It's a shiny new thing. It gets called a lot of different things. We've heard terminology out there that gets a little bit fluffy: IoT platforms, intelligent building management platform, digital twin, IoT platform, and you pretty much run a gamut of different acronyms out there. And so the idea or the dream is, I want a platform. We're going to implement this platform. It's going to be absolutely amazing, and it's going to solve all of our problems. And I'm going to be able to report back to the business that we had all of these amazing measurable returns. So that's the thought that goes behind this. What typically happens for any of us when we're having these discussions with a primary stakeholder of whoever's wanting to do this project, or we're talking to a number of stakeholders, we end up having to unveil and kind of pull the curtain back a little bit on some of the things that are missing. And there's a lot that's missing in this vision. There are things that aren't defined. There are things that need to be remediated within infrastructure. There's just a number of different things that need to be thought about as we go from where current state is to this vision of this awesome smart building infrastructure that's going to solve all of your problems and create measurable return. And so throughout the discussion today, we're going to walk you through methodically on how the consultants on this call or on this discussion today, how we methodically go through this with our customers. And we're going to start kind of phase by phase. We're going to hear from the different panelists, and we're going to talk through really this course of action as a workflow to get you from where you are today to where you want to be, and getting to the point where you can actually measure return and get the outcomes that you are looking for. So I am joined today by a group of very intelligent, highly esteemed subject matter experts. Just to kind of go through them and give them each a bit an opportunity to talk about themselves. But I am joined with Seth Ferrara, who is with McDonald Miller Facility Solutions, Trevor Sodorf with MSIE, Joe Wilkinson, ATS Automation, and Drew DePriest from McKesson. Seth, why don't we start with you? You want to give our audience a little bit of your background, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. So yes, my name is Seth Ferrara, and I am the Smart Buildings Program Manager here at McDonald Miller. I have a background in mechanical engineering. That's what I went to school for. So I have a good understanding of the types of systems that are in facilities. Then I got exposure to doing mechanical design at our national labs, and really got an idea of how to leverage data in order to make better decisions about where to go for development purposes. And then I got to spend a lot of time just in building operations, working in our national labs on the building operations teams there, and then shifting over to controls and actually deploying control systems within commercial, industrial, and critical spaces. And I've kind of taken all of that collective experience and put it together to start looking at smart buildings. How do we start leveraging data to make better decisions within building operations?
Very good. Appreciate you joining us today, Seth. Trevor, how about you?
My name is Trevor Sodorf. I'm a mechanical engineer and I work for a company called MSIE. We specialize in essentially getting data out of buildings and into platforms or into systems that can use that data. My background is almost entirely within this space. I've spent the last 13 years now, 14 years, helping some of the biggest companies in the world build platforms and implement third-party platforms in effective ways. And yeah, there are a lot of gotchas and a lot of things that I'm interested to talk about here today with, what makes something successful versus not successful, or what can stymie success or, leads to success if you do certain things in the beginning.
Very good. Appreciate you joining us today, Trevor. Joe, how about you, sir?
Thanks, Kyle. Hi, I'm Joe Wilkinson with ATS Automation. I am a ESCO project developer here at ATS, so I kind of work on our energy side of the business. My background is I was a nuclear reactor operator in the United States Navy, 20 some years ago now, a long time ago. And then spent about 18 years in our operations department executing controls projects, mostly for like high tech sector and things like that. So we've been talking about smart buildings since probably 2015 with a lot of those clients. And so I'm just really excited to be here today and add to the conversation, as smart buildings is kind of a passion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Drew, last but not least.
Sure, I'll bring up the caboose here. Howdy, everybody. I'm Drew DePriest, based just outside of Chicago, and I lead technology for the internal real estate team at a great big giant company called McKesson. We've been fortunate to, in the last couple of years, massive portfolio spread across office, industrial, as well as medical office. I've been in the space for 20 years, literally 20 years to June 1st. It's my first day of working in Tritium R2 and Honeywell XL15s with the little blinking lights of doom for anybody that remembers. I've touched pretty much everything in the BMS space, workplace tech. Big focus and interest right now around data architecture, aggregation, trying to push more of taking BMS and controls from just a control signal to a true mode of telemetry up to cloud, so we can start doing some cool predictive things with it. So between that and cybersecurity and wishing I was a hacker some days, it keeps things fun.
Really appreciate you joining us as well, Drew. So let's get things kicked off here. So the folks that are on this panel today, myself included, we've spent years working on smart building projects, getting into digital infrastructure, getting into the OT, the IT, the IoT, and we've seen projects go extremely well. And I think all of us have probably been part of projects at some points in our career that maybe didn't go quite so well. We're going to cover a lot of the reasons why things don't go well and do go well as throughout the conversation today. And we want to make sure that by the time that you leave today's discussion, you have a good idea of where you need to start, the things you need to be thinking about to ensure that your smart building platform that you invest in is going to be the right fit and delivers the outcomes that you are looking for. Now, me personally, as someone who has sold smart building platforms, again, all the different flavored acronyms that get called with the customers that I've worked with over the years, as well as been on the owner's rep side as a consultant, I have found in the projects that I've worked on, the projects that seem to go well, the ones that tend to have a little bit more trajectory to it to get to an outcome, have typically had some sort of visionary or well thought out defined vision, but someone's got to own the thing and kind of drive on the client side. Now, Drew, you've also been on the vendor side as well as you've been on the owner side. When someone within your organization or when you're on the vendor side says, hey, I just need a smart building platform, it doesn't really mean a whole lot without that vision or that definition. Can you give the audience an idea of how you've approached defining a vision, how you've gained alignment internally with, now that you're at McKesson, to move forward with a plan. You're on mute.
There we go. Rookie mistake. You sit here and talk about technology for 20 years and then can't even operate a microphone button. With the caveat of, I think the most successful programs I've been a part of, either deployment, operations, whichever side of that table I've been on, having a single person to own an entire program as a champion, not always the visionary, at least in my experience. That person may not be the SME on everything, but they know where they need to go with a particular program. From a tactical perspective, that always comes down to two things in my world, especially the last 5 or 6 years. Really understanding and defining with crystal clear granularity what your business outcomes are. And a lot of those are going to sound very familiar right now if you're focused on just pure ESG, energy efficiency, decarbonization. If you have spaces and facilities that have a critical infrastructure component to it, if there's audit compliance, depending on what you may be storing in some of these spaces, if it's occupant comfort, if it's a showcase space for a headquarters or some other kind of regional office, understanding what each of those outcomes really holds across the business, and then how you prioritize those. And I've seen this far too often where someone will go to RFP for a smart building package on a new headquarters project, and there will be 85 requirements and outcomes. And with 0 degree of prioritization, everyone looking at it just assumes, oh, cool, they want everything. So here's $40 million that it's going to cost you to stand up everything, when really all somebody wanted was, maybe the top 5. Yeah. So business outcomes, prioritization, and then that just goes straight into pure requirements. Some of the constraints, cybersecurity element, all those kinds of things. But just being able to tactically define those things, to me, has been the biggest driver.
Let's open this up to the rest of the group. Joe, Trevor, any of you guys have anything you want to add to what Drew shared?
I think the number one thing that Drew shared was having a champion. That's probably one of the most critical things that you can have when you're moving forward with smart buildings, is having a person that's passionate about what you're doing, understands your vision, and knows how to get things done within your organization. So I really, flew into that, Drew. Felt that personally, in trying to execute projects on the energy side of things. Sure.
Plus one to that, I've seen a lot of projects fail because you have people with competing visions essentially within the same organization, and it just leads to not compromise, but like ineffectiveness. At some point, you need a tiebreaker, and that hierarchy is really important. As much as we'd like to think that this is kind of a collaborative space, when it gets into the nitty gritty of how it gets deployed within an organization, you have to have somebody that can fight through the quagmire of bureaucracy and allow things to get done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to echo my colleagues there, having that person that has in the end, the responsibility, right? Someone has to be accountable to make sure that the project is successful. So, Drew says you have 85 items from all these different internal teams. If there isn't someone who has the responsibility and accountability to get down to the 5 that actually matter today, then you're going to have, a bloated project or a bunch of technology that isn't used out there in the field.
Well, speaking of having a laundry list of just items and things that people want to get done, let's dive a little bit deeper into that side of the conversation. So, when you're deciding what use cases are actually going to become a reality in a given project, it can be extremely painful. You've got different people with different visions of what they think is most important. And to Drew's point, trying to prioritize that can be an absolute pain when you're dealing with internal politics and you're trying to balance all of this to get to that final outcome, at least that day one outcome. Now, Trevor, I want to kind of steer this towards you a little bit here. So when you have people, you have folks from facilities, you have folks from property operations, you've got people from workplace experience, IT, engineering, and they're all coming to the table with all of their laundry list of things that they quote unquote have to have. Like, how do you rein that in and get to what the production day one is going to be, or what that MVP version of this smart building vision? How do you get to that?
Well, first of all, that's a very good problem to have. because I've seen way too many times where people don't come to the table, and it's like one or two little groups that are like trying to stand this up. And at some point in time in the future, the other groups get wind of it and want to pile on, but they're not brought in from the beginning. So like, first of all, really good problem to have. You really do want to get engagement across a broader swath of the organization, across the different groups that you're even talking about, kind of before you start anything, because you need to know what the progression looks like. Now, there's no harm in my experience of talking about use cases, even somewhat futuristic use cases, because a use case is going to be dictated by a couple of different things. It's going to be dictated by the utility of that use case, like what it can do for the organization, but it's also going to be constrained by the capabilities of the organization and the infrastructure that you have, right? So building a big laundry list that covers like, here's what we need to be able to do for AV. Here's what we need to be able to do for IT security. Here's what we need to be able to do for facilities management. Here's what we need to be able to do for, energy conservation and ESG reporting. Gathering all of those requirements and getting them to a degree of detail that allows you to determine what your capabilities are within your existing infrastructure, like do that and do that as broadly as you can. And then in the next step, which is really evaluating your own infrastructure, the constraints will start to drive you towards that prioritization. You'll have your tangible benefits on one side, you're going to have your constraints on the other. And the thing, if you do it right, will kind of naturally sort itself. And it will also do the added thing of giving you a longer term roadmap, which is what you really need to have if you're going to choose the smart building platform that's right for you from the beginning, right? Because you don't want to stand up something here that solves for these couple of use cases, but ignores the needs of future easily foreseeable use cases.
I think it's also it's really important if you do have all those stakeholders in the room speaking to a vision or an end goal. I've dealt in projects before on the corporate side where I've had folks in engineering, I've had folks in workplace that have both gone to market to look for IoT occupancy sensors, and they both did separate procurement process because they weren't in the same room talking to each other, and they got two redundant technologies put into their space, when if they would have been in the same room at least talking to each other, which I think is a lot of companies struggle with, is just getting people in the room and having the conversation of what all are we doing. But I mean, I've seen just wasted money left and right on redundancies that were just completely unnecessary. Drew, Seth, you guys have anything to add on that?
And the way I think about it is this entire, it's a product, and you have to think of it as such. And the broader convergence of the software world into kind of what we do that's historically been more construction minded, of just everything is project based, plans and spec, you go do it. And this to me, what Trevor's describing is what any strong software product development team, that's how they're going to think about it. They're going to go have conversations with their power users. They're going to document their use cases. They're going to build a roadmap and say that, based on these priority P1 things, we're going to do these next quarter, and then we'll evaluate that. And then everything else we slot the following quarters, unless we get funding, unless we get additional resource, and then we pull some of that stuff up. So it has to be more of a product management approach, and not just this one-off, hey, we got 100 million in capital to go spend, let's just go do it, because that will fail.
Just to clarify, you're talking about on the buying side. You're not talking about because a lot of times what you'll see, right, is that people kind of outsource that to the first vendor through the door, right? And it's like, well, I want to be able to do I've seen that happen a couple of times. And so it's I think what you're saying is a really important thing, that it's internal, and you need to have that strong product management mindset. If not a program management mindset, it is a program, it's owned by the organization, and you have to have that strong management structure in place, kind of going back to the visionary, but a tier down.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I'm responsible for the architecture of 5 or 6 different service line use cases right now. And some of the times they need to intersect, and sometimes they don't. So I cannot rely on a single vendor to just go own BMS, because they won't know anything about these other 4 or 5. Whereas I have to look at it in the aggregate. So it's the ability to not only take a point solution and stitch it into a broader program or a product, but then also to be able to hot swap those things as I need to. So if we get to a place where, this particular vendor is no longer working out, I need to be able to replace that with as little downtime and impact as possible.
Right. I mean, that's a good point, Drew. You also have to be very careful when you're picking partners, right? Because you want to pick a partner that's going to, work with you to develop things. A lot of partners, they're just looking to get in, do what they need to do and get back out on a plan to spec basis. But, choosing the right partner that's going to work with you, understand that your vision might not be fully baked when you get started, but are going to work with you to kind of help implement that vision and work with your champion is super important when you're moving forward.
I think it's generally cool to talk with, product vendors at a high level about like what is happening in the space to understand capabilities and to like kind of bolster up like, you internally, I think about these use cases, but what else is the industry in general doing? I think that's not a bad thing to do at this point in the process, but it's one of those things where you have to, take kind of the aggregate of everything. And then going into the next step of this thing is really evaluating where your internal capabilities are and your, not just like from a people perspective, but also from a technology perspective.
Well, let's one thing about that before we get into that next phase. So when we look at the use cases, and for everyone in the audience, when you think about the use cases, if you have someone support you and help you define and build out and do use case design work with you, what you should be able to identify once that is done is what data needs to be exposed and which systems are going to make that data available to you. And once you understand that, that's going to tell you and give you the ability to start to formulate what your architecture needs to look like. And in order to get to that Delta architecture, there's another phase involved here. So Seth, I'm gonna steer this towards you. Now that we know what use cases we want to enable, at least day one, right? Maybe we've narrowed it down to those 5. We know what data we need to make available. We know which systems are going to make that available. Where does the audience go from here? What's that next thing that they need to do before they just go and slap in a smart building technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, go identify what your goals are and where you want to be, down the road. But in order to get there, you're going to have to really understand where are you today, right? What data is actually available out of your system, and is it the data needed to enable those goals that you have for your smart buildings program? So really, taking a step back and meeting when you're meeting with these other teams and trying to understand what their goals are, also collecting the stories of what systems are they using today, what data is available to them today. Making sure to go through that conversation while you're trying to define your goals is obviously very efficient way to go about that. As you have everyone in the room together and you're talking through those things, having the experts who are using the different systems within your building able to provide the information to you of what they're going to need to be upgrading in order to maybe achieve some of the use cases that you're trying to do. Like looking at your building control system, making sure that you have the correct sensors in place in order to, if you're wanting to implement an enhanced sequence of operations to take advantage of, the research that has been done on how to operate equipment better, you need to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place within your control system in order to be able to leverage that enhancement. So making sure you have a very clear idea of what is available to you today is very important. Going through your HVAC and your control systems, your lighting systems, making sure that are those systems even integrated together today to be able to talk to each other, or is that something you have to make sure to get into your roadmap of making sure all these systems do have the ability to communicate back and forth and share the data between them. When you're talking about smart buildings, a lot of what we're trying to get to is some automation of your facility to make sure that you don't need people constantly looking at it to make sure that it is operating the way that you want it to be operating. But in order to enable that automation, you have to make sure that the systems that you have in place are able to communicate to each other and pass that data back and forth. So doing a very good audit of the systems today, what you have today, is going to then enable you to understand what additional systems or sensors or software do we need in order to actually enable our use cases. I think one of the really cool things as you're going through with your internal teams and collecting those stories, you'll start to identify the overlap, right? there's a lot of teams out there. You mentioned the occupancy sensors, right? If you get those people in the room and you understand where the overlap is too, you'll be able to gain efficiencies for just purchasing one occupancy sensor instead of 2 occupancy sensors. So making sure, again, you get the right people in the room and you get the information from them of what they have available and what they're going to need to enable the use cases that you're trying to achieve.
Anybody else on the panel have anything you want to add?
Would caution folks a little bit around, and this may sound semantic, but the definition of data. And to me, anything that's in a closed loop, like a BAS or BMS, is a control signal. It's not a data point to me until I have a way to normalize, extract, and push it into some agnostic data store that I can then go do all kinds of other correlation, predictive machine learning analysis on top of. Because eventually from a portfolio enterprise perspective, being able to take operational signals, learn from them historically, and then put them up against broader business systems, looking at kind of asset management, even getting to a level of, lease aggregation in some cases. Data to me is it's a little bit bigger, a little bit beyond the BMS piece, but from an integration of making sure that if an occupancy sensor trips in a particular corner of an office, that ties to VAV7, absolutely, all day, every day, that completely makes sense to me. It's the just feel like there's a horizontal data signal, control signal connection between these systems, and then even thinking about pushing that up into some other layer. Just it needs a different lens looking at it, because then you get into data compliance and data governance and data quality and freshness and accuracy and all kinds of other things that may exceed some scope of BAS.
Yeah, that's a good point, Drew. I think, also what's really important as you're going through this process is looking at your entire portfolio and trying to figure out what some really easy wins are. Like any other project, it can gain momentum over time. So you don't want to start with something that's going to be super difficult or, really challenging or take a long time to finish. You want something that you can go in, everything's already backnet, sounds great. Let's go ahead and kind of move forward from there. And sometimes those early wins can really help your champion kind of proceed, across the entire portfolio from there.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you're discussing, Drew, because like data governance, I think has its beginnings at the latest, I think, in this stage, right? Because as you're going through and trying to figure out what systems you have, people oftentimes will think of that audit as being like a physical audit, like a hardware audit, like how many controllers do I have of this type? What's the vintage of this lighting system? It's that data piece that's also really important. And it's the drift in those data systems that you also have to have a reasonable understanding of. Some organizations, their systems really don't change over time because they set them and forget them. Other organizations are changing them all the live long day. And you have to know which kind of organization you are, because the systems that you put on top of it or that you use to integrate with it need to be robust against those types of changes, not just, the physical hardware changes, but also digital changes. So when we say audit, people typically think OT, but you also need to think digitally as well, I think. It's the wise person would do that at that stage as well.
Yeah,
I agree with that. Something else that I see get missed if you're not, especially thinking of things as programmatic approach, is the operationalization of everything. To your point, Trevor, like when something does inevitably change, how do we handle it? Do we document it? Do we follow? Last couple of years, the MACD or move, add, change, delete for any IP-based device, like just like an enterprise IT team does when they need to move a switch or an AP or something else in their infrastructure. Like we should be doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. Full stop, because then like everything downstream of that, point names are going to change. You can write a point name standard all you want, but if you get 2 different programmers in 2 different buildings in a portfolio, zone temp is going to be in one place and space temp is going to be in the other, and then that breaks everything upstream.
Having some robustness against that sort of entropy within a system, obviously, like we're setting the stage here because like dealing with entropy at like the highest level, right, is it becomes a requirement, a technical requirement for the solution that you're about to pick. And so like, I know that we're 20 minutes, 30 minutes into this conversation, and we're kind of still on like all the pre-work that needs to be done. But like, there are little tidbits that come out of that, right? Because I think the big mistake that people often make is that like, I want FTD. No, I didn't want FTD. I don't know. I just want it. I saw it in an article, right? Like, and this is maybe truer of smaller companies and like huge, gigantic companies, but like you want it, but you don't know why you want it. And you don't understand all the little bits that need to be accounted for as you're going to be deploying it. And then people are inevitably disappointed because, oh, I didn't realize that I would have to, hire somebody to maintain this system over time because we didn't build out a process that was semi-automated for doing that for us, right? Like, this is the time to think about it before you've even gone to RFI.
Oh. Think about it through this lens, right? Is it more expensive to do it right the first time, or to have an infrastructure that's not flexible, that's not set up the right way, an architecture that's not going to allow you to do things 5, 7, 10 years from now and have to rip everything out and redo it, right? So it's better to make sure that we're doing it right the first time.
I would argue that you should just expect entropy. Like, it is a given in what we do.
For sure.
It is my response most of the time when somebody complains around facilities being slow to adopt newer technology. It's the wholly dynamic, entropy laden just characteristic of what we're doing. Go look at a financial system. They're tracking bank data. That never changes, ever. It's the same structure, same schema every single time for millions and millions of rows and records. Our stuff could change in 2 hours and no one's going to know in some cases. So it's the very nature. I love this concept of entropy, Trevor. I will send you a check every time I throw that out. But I think you just have to expect it, and you have to build that into SOP and operations to understand how to deal with it.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. We're here talking about technology and how to get more technology in the buildings to help us answer better questions, but really remembering that it's people who are using the technology. It's people who have to maintain the technology over time. So ensuring that you're thinking about that and not only current project, but also the long-term vision of how you're going to continue to operate your building through a smart buildings program, making sure to focus on the people is really important.
And the processes that you can change and that you cannot change. I think oftentimes people get very idealized. I worked with one company that tried to create a BACnet standard for like every possible point they would ever run into on particular systems. And like, it was a beautiful standard, really well thought out. I don't think it ever got implemented in one single place. And you have to balance the practicality of the situation of managing a portfolio that's larger than 1 or 2 buildings, right? You have to balance some expectation against procedures and processes that you could effectively put in place. But having an ideally static system is just not realistic. But on the same spectrum, you can't just go all the way the other way and let it be the Wild West. You have to have some constraints in there, but let them converge over time and have an expectation of drift to some degree, and then make sure that when you're selecting your product, that there is tested mechanisms for handling drift. BACnet discovery, for example, and automated onboarding for, VAVs or whatever. Like, we can talk about some of the bits and pieces that would need to be in there, but like, now you're getting to the point where it's like, okay, this is what I'm going to need in my technical requirements if I go to RFI to different vendors to provide this, or if I'm going to an internal team to help build this.
Yeah. Let's carry that thought forward. As we look at use cases, we look at the data that needs to be made available. We then have what systems need to be put into the infrastructure to even allow a smart building platform to do what it's intended to do. We need to talk about some of those standards, some of the things that can be repeatable, not just in single asset, but for those of you that have a portfolio of assets, how do we carry that forward through additional buildings? And so as we look to enhance building infrastructure, we've assessed what we have. We have a remediation strategy or a enhancement or investment strategy to upgrade the building to get it where it needs to be in order to support the smart building platform. Joe, I'm going to point this towards you is, how do we ensure that we're not missing the mark with any of this slew of vendors that we either currently have in our infrastructure that need to come up to what we need them to be, or we're going to evaluate new vendors that are going to come into our environment, right? How do we make sure that we're not missing the mark in that they are going to be able to not just fit into our ecosystem, but also deliver the outcomes that they're saying that they're going to be able to deliver?
Right. Yeah. I think, Kyle, I think the biggest thing is that's a part of that is what we talked about already, which is getting that champion in place, right? Once the champion's in place, they can kind of control and put out standardization, across your portfolio, whether it's new buildings that you're bringing in or existing buildings that you want to bring up to that standard. So the champion needs to understand that vision. And so what does standardizing look like? First you have to kind of normalize the data. An air handler in one place needs to look like an air handler in another place. Same thing, with like lighting, all those kind of integrated building systems. You have to kind of know that you're talking apples to apples when you're talking between buildings A, B, and C. And then also you have to use open protocols when you're connecting systems together. Open protocols, I think we're all on that train at this point. The proprietary protocols are kind of a thing of the past almost, but it's really important that all of your systems be able to speak the same language so that you can bring them up into whatever platform you decide. And again, these are things that you decide, I think, before you even pick a smart building platform. You need to know what it can do and, have the data normalized across the entire platform. So, yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the most important part, is making sure that everything can talk the same. And then that'll also give you the widest array of selection when you talk about smart building platforms moving forward.
I appreciate that, Joe. What about the rest of the panel? Anyone else have anything they want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree that having a plan to make sure that you're standardized across your portfolio is definitely incredibly useful. When you start to talk about leveraging tools like FDD, if you have a standard building control deployment across all your facilities, getting that into an FDD tool is much simpler, right? I think, but back to making sure you're selecting tools that are also flexible, ensuring that you're selecting, an FDD tool that can maybe take on multiple different kinds of control systems to integrate together so that you can satisfy that use case today, so that you can get to the value of what an FDD can provide, but then also be able to get that into your long-term vision of upgrading all of your control systems to BA standard, right? So making sure that you have that flexibility still to get what you need today, while also thinking about how to continue to upgrade your portfolio into the future.
And I'll share that time and time again. I've heard stories where prior to getting a consultant or an engineering firm involved, I've seen where companies have gone and they've procured some sort of technology. One recently I heard was a water treatment system, but because they didn't have any sort of defined standards to hand over to the vendor that was installing, vendors typically are going to refer back to what they consider best practice or what is their way of doing things. Just because it's best practice or it's their way of doing things does not mean it is the way that you want to do things, right? So it's very important that for whatever entity that you're representing and you're going selecting a smart building technology or any vendor technology to bring into your ecosystem, that not only are they adherent to your way of doing things the way that you want it implemented, you need to have those things documented and defined so that when you hand those standards, that this document over to a master systems integrator, a general contractor, an engineering consulting firm that's going to help you implement these things, that they have the ability to provide some sort of level of governance and oversight to making sure that all the different parties that are involved are adherent to your standards. That is the only way you're going to get the outcomes that you're asking for.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kyle. It goes back to that selecting the right partners thing and people that are willing to work with you and be on the team and help, realize your vision. It's super.
I will say that's the biggest risk on the buyer and owner side is the enforcement of that standard.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen it happen far too often where we spend 6 weeks, couple months writing this beautiful, glorious 30-page standards doc, and we all shake hands and walk away. And then you get to commissioning for the next construction project and 20% of it gets followed. And there's no one in that chain that points to it to enforce, hey, what about the other 80%? You didn't name your points, you didn't tag anything in brick, specific to how we all called it out. So, I mean, not to keep banging the drum of process, but I'm going to. Any standards doc, absolutely 100,000% needs to be part of commissioning, it needs to be part of owner acceptance, UAT, everything. Because if not, then you are just wasting your time and energy writing a document.
And it needs to be, at least to some degree, automatically verifiable.
Yep. Yeah.
Like when you're a company and you've got 100 buildings around the world, like you really can't be doing like this ticky-tacky, certainly digital check off, because you can't do it continuously. And these processes need to be, to some degree, continuously run.
Mhm. Yeah, you'll mire down your champion real quick.
But I think what's important to also remember here is that what we're talking about with this governance does become in some ways a use case for a platform. And there are platforms that like, hey, we help you to manage that drift in your underlying systems, and we can help with, giving you better commissioning tools for integration. And so knowing who's going to be using it and knowing that it's a use case at all, I think is a good thing to have, because oftentimes you get to the point where it's like, oh, well, we got to pick the platform, but how you keep the platform running over time isn't necessarily considered as part of that process.
All right, guys. Well, so now that we've talked through some of these preliminary steps, all the foundational things, the groundwork that needs to be done before we go out and procure, we've got use cases defined. We know what our infrastructure looks like. We've got a remediation strategy across the portfolio or single building. We've got our requirements defined, and now we can pretty much go to market and either go out and find that technology that's going to check as many of the boxes as we possibly can, or have someone as a partner that's going to help us and support us as we go out and look for this smart building technology that we want to bring in. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for the group again. And Trevor, give me a thumbs up. Everyone see me?
You're good.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. So, we talked through several of these steps, right? Now we need to get to the point where we have a good platform, right? We got to go to market. We got to select one. So just some things to think about as you're going out, whether it's a sole source type of initiative that you have, if you're going to go out and pilot a couple of different platforms, or you've got a third party that's assisting you that has a lot of subject matter expertise around the different vendors that are out there. Whichever way you end up going, these are just some tidbits of information that you need to be thinking about as you're looking at all of the different slew of vendors out there, because there is a very large pool of vendors out there that say they do these things. They may do them in different ways. And again, call themselves different things. So I would encourage you to find someone that can help support you kind of navigate the swamp of technology vendors that are out there that fit this mold. But again, the things that you need to lay foundationally is having a good vision. Make sure you have well-defined requirements and use cases, have a good understanding of what your current infrastructure. And then when you go out and look at these vendors, right, make sure that they've got a background, right? Have they actually done this before? Have they done this for a type of building that is similar to you? If you are a life sciences building that has part office and part lab, do they have experiences in working in lab environments? That's not the same thing as working in an office building. Can they support the use cases and align to your digital standards that Joe was talking about? Do they have experience in working across all asset classes that are within your portfolio? What's their roadmap look like? I would also, to add to this, I would be asking what their financial standing is as well. Over the last several years, we've seen a lot of volatility in the prop tech market. You've got a lot of companies that are getting acquired. You've got a lot of companies that are disappearing. There's a lot of consolidation. So whichever pony that you decide to ride for your building your portfolio, you need to make sure you're doing your due diligence to find out, are they going to be here in 2 years, or are they going to get snatched up by another larger entity that maybe you don't want to do business with? All things that you need to be thinking about. And lastly, but not least, making sure that they can support all of your workflows, right? So for the rest of the panel, is there anything that any of you would add to this list that we didn't just talk through?
Pilot. I am a huge proponent of piloting things before you scale them. That'll allow you to assess a lot of these things, not just the technical, but also, the dynamism of the team that you're working with, which I think is honestly very important as you're evaluating technologies, right? They might not have the best technology, but if they have a really good team behind them that is able to align well with your roadmap, I've seen companies go with smaller entities because they have that dynamism that they can work with and partner with long term. But run it as a pilot. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We're talking about, hey, up front, you need to make sure that you identify all these things, and there's bound to be things that people miss, right? People can't think of all the nitty gritty details of everything all at the same time. So if you're able to go through a pilot, you can help maybe identify some of those things that could have been missed during that initial stage. So yeah, full agreement. Piloting solutions is definitely very useful.
Yeah, and pilot multiple people too. I mean,
Mhm.
Don't be afraid to do that at the same time. We'll give, vendor A this floor of this building, vendor B the floor of this building. I'm not saying make it a competition, but make it a competition and see. I agree with you, Trevor. The team is probably way more valuable than the tech. Absolutely. I mean, if the team is willing to work with you, they can usually mold and shape the tech to fit your needs. But if you have a team that's not willing to work with you, it could be the best tech in the world and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think about as well from a procurement perspective, cost transparency and a full transparency on business model. To the points we just talked about, like I don't expect that what we put in day one is going to be what's still there day 2, day 3. So I need to know, if we need to go the custom dev path, like what a rates looks like, how much does a sprint cost me if I need a new feature added to a thing. From a SaaS perspective, because generally everybody charges an annual fee for something these days. What is the tier structure? What is the model that goes into, how do we pivot? Is it square footage? Is it points? Is it licenses? So I can start thinking about if it's, X dollars per building today, building one for a pilot, what does it look like at 100 6 months from now or 5 years from now? I still, and I know it always hurts to talk about the divorce as you're getting married. But how restrictive on proprietary anything is a platform, is a system. So if and when we get to a point where we need to say, peace, we're out of here, how hard is it going to be for me as an owner to unplug from one thing and plug into another? It sucks, but it has to be talked about at some point. And then the support piece, especially from an operations perspective, like there are some software providers I've worked with in the past that it shouldn't take me 4 days to get a response on a ticket. I should be able to go and look at, if you're a cloud platform, what's your availability? What has it been historically? If you're claiming, 395 in an SLA in a contract, give me the ability to go track that. Instead of relying on either me pinging your server every day and somehow scraping that ourselves, or a static report, like all these other kind of enterprise software things that just should be table stakes these days. I evaluate people on that just as much as the strength of the tech.
There's speaking to some of the OpEx side of that and the SaaS subscription side of it, like some of the things to think about, and this is going to depend on your individual buildings, but let's look at some of the contextual data points that enable a lot of the different use cases with a smart building platform. So like people counters, for example, right? You put those IoT devices in. A lot of these vendors, they have the CapEx side of it, so the physical hardware that goes into this, and then a lot of them will have the OpEx side of this, and they'll have you pay a toll to get access to the data that you then need to feed into some other analytics platform, and they want you to pay for their analytics platform. Well, most of the large enterprise customers that I work with, they've got their own visualization tool that they're using above and beyond whatever the IoT sensor company is providing as a visualization tool. And so I always encourage them, it's like we need to make sure that we find IoT sensors and people counters that have a CapEx option that is not going to require you to pay a subscription to use an analytics solution that you're not going to use to get a data feed that's going to feed into whatever visualization tool that you're going to be using. That's probably going to be a component of your smart building platform that you're going to be investing in. So like those are just other things, again, that you need to be thinking about as you're looking at your infrastructure, your architecture, and which vendors you're going to bring to the table is, what impact, as Drew was speaking to, is going to impact your operational costs, because that's drastically going to impact your financials and the way that you're evaluating any sort of return that you're getting on the investment for your smart building platform. All right. Anybody have anything else they want to add on this before we jump into, I'm going to end up pivoting back over to Drew here on the procurement side of things, but anyone else have anything else they want to add before we jump into that side of the conversation? All right. So, Drew, being on the buyer side and on the procurement side, all right. So it's one thing to have your vision and your plan in place. Help us understand, with all of the different stakeholders that you have internally there, getting them on board with actually pulling the trigger on this thing. How do you go about quantifying the value that you're going to get on this path internally, and ultimately gain the go ahead with the purchasing of something that's going to have such an impact across your portfolio of assets that you're responsible for?
So short answer, it depends. If it's part of an existing planned allocated chunk of capital that's going to, let's just say, new building, new construction, somewhere in there, I get to raise my hand and say, this is what we want. And then cross fingers and hope that when the time comes that we get as much of that as we can. If it's more of a kind of a one-off, if it's an upgrade, if it's a renovation of a floor instead of a ground up rebuild, then it's more of it's a smaller off-cycle capital request. And it doesn't matter if I'm trying to buy software, if I'm trying to buy sensors, if I'm trying to put in all new VAV gear across 10 different floors, every single one has a business case. And most big companies will generally have a template that, depending on how you're structured within FM and real estate, in some cases, certain thresholds can only go up to the VP of FM or whoever kind of leads your FM group. Sometimes they have to go to finance. So in that case, I have to lay out every single cost, length of contract, risks and challenges that go into that. And then certainly the ability to try to quantify some degree of value. And it has to be like, I'm very fortunate. I have a strong partner in finance on our real estate team who doesn't know a thing about BMS. And I don't expect him to. He and I will sit down and we'll say, I need to get X amount of money to go do this thing. And he's going to ask me, what's the value? Like, how do I show the math? If we can't show the work on how we got to, it's going to save us 10% on energy costs and it's going to reduce hot cold calls by X amount. If you can't, this sounds obvious and something we've been saying for 20 years. Like, if you don't have measurable data to back that up, CFO is just going to toss you right out and it's not going to go anywhere. I would also add the last thing. We started to see a little bit of a shift, kind of a softening, not everywhere, and I've talked to other friends, other companies, it's not holding up everywhere, but starting to more accept at least some aspect of BMS upgrade is just an operational thing we have to do. We may not be able to quote or guarantee, any ROI, or we may save $100 next year, but it becomes more of a risk mitigation conversation. If we don't do this thing, then the CEO is going to scream once a week because their office is too hot. We have vulnerabilities left and right in all the software, and cybersecurity is going to get angry. I'm going to fail an audit. So it's not just about what can we save, it's what can we avoid that is a little squishier, a little harder to quantify, but still has value in that business case conversation.
So basically adjust it so that it's a compliance need rather than a
it's the cost of doing business. First, for some things. There are use cases where that applies. That's not everything, but I've tried to make that argument a couple times over the last couple of years, and it can be compelling for the right issue.
Would you say that for, let's say, some of the more workplace experience focused use cases, do you feel that those kind of fall into that same vein where that's just whether it's a return to office program or it's just cost of doing business? Does it fall into that? Because I find a lot of companies they struggle with quantifying a lot of those use cases on any sort of return. So how have you approached those types of use cases?
Yeah, that is the hardest, most squishy thing in the world to try to quantify. I've seen people try. I've seen some pretty horrid reactions from hard finance folks of quoting productivity increases of, if I give you wayfinding and the ability to book a desk, like you're going to work 2% harder with a higher output. And if I aggregate that across an average salary of $90,000 for 20 people, like that's worth whatever that math is that I can't do right now in my head. You can't guarantee it. You absolutely cannot measure that. That sort of area of the industry to me, and I've worked in it, I've tried to sell it, I've deployed it, I know it well. It is more of a nice to have. Yeah. And it's typically something I see if your company is allotting budget to workplace experience, that's the wallet that you're trying to share. It is not something that you're going to come in and say, here's a hard ROI on an experience app. Like it's not a thing.
So go into the business and saying I'm going to work 11% harder because I can adjust the VAV airflow right above my cubicle. It's not going to jive.
No, I mean they'll tell me, why aren't you working 11% harder anyway?
The lower that number goes, though, right, the easier it is to swallow the squishiness, right? Tie it. I think one of the things that everybody and their mother is seeing is like, go for energy savings, because that'll put the infrastructure in place, tangibly justifiable, and then add on to it with the squishier stuff once it's in play.
I even find that gets squishy, Trevor, because you can only pile on so many vendors that are going to save you 20% energy efficiency on top of each other and get that return.
Yeah, but there's a long road of very I don't even know what you would call it, Asimovian the road mapping that you can do, right? Where you got like, automated buildings using ML. Okay, well, that'll get us some extra savings if we can just build to that. We have other things like automated commissioning, which doesn't need as much AI as it just needs the integration stuff. And like, you can put that into the roadmap. It's like, we got these things that we can do that are very tangible, very justifiable, that are also very, maybe not forward thinking, but like harder to do, give you something to do for 5 years.
Well, it's also, you're kind of setting up for the future with a lot of this too, right? Like, you never know what standard's going to get passed at the state legislature, and you're going to have to comply with that in 5 or 10 years, and having an up-to-date systems is going to give you the greatest chance of success, so you don't have such a heavy lift when those standards come out too.
And I think that's the real big thing that certainly applies to a lot of the sectors that deal a lot with refrigerant management, right? Like, because of compliance requirements, right? Are we going to have to put this infrastructure in place simply to be able to report to the EPA on what our refrigerant is doing, right? Like using the law to our advantage is also something worth considering. And I've seen it done effectively within certain organizations, and it's quite nice to see the wallets open up because of the fact that, like, there are new federal requirements we got to comply with.
I do like, Trevor, what you're saying about laying the groundwork with an architecture. I've heard more about that, not even within our own space, but just inclusive, but other software nerd friends abroad as well, of whatever your feelings around the buzz or hype or reality of AI and generative and all this other stuff. That has found the ear of many, many senior executives across a number of large companies globally. And I'm starting to hear, more of, hey, we can invest in our architecture and just build this foundational stuff, because that helps us make progress toward this massive corporate initiative that, if you were to say to anyone in any technology role, smart buildings or otherwise right now, like, go turn on AI for all of your systems. They're going to look at you like you've got 8 heads. And it's like, I can't do that until I get all of this other foundational stuff done. So there is some harder to quantify, but when you're tying to making progress to someone else's big high level initiative, like that's compelling as well.
Or cyber's, you know, like you could trying to help them dream the big dream is one approach. Fear is also a good approach, right?
Yes.
Cyber
Fear
security,
works. Yeah.
fear will definitely help justify things, because if you can even very tenuously tie it to cybersecurity, right? Like we have to replace these controllers. What if we get hacked, right? Like if you can come up with a strategy like that, it's the carrot and the stick when going to the finance bugs, right?
It's Psych 101, man. It's to your brain, there is no chemical difference between excitement and abject terror. It does the same thing to you.
And this is why a strong visionary is really a key part of this process, because this kind of schemery needs to happen at the highest level it can.
Yep.
Agree.
So I am going to jump into a Q&A question. So we're going to go back to the conversation around entropy. All right, this question's for the broad panel. Does the panel have practical ideas on dealing with entropy throughout the building life cycle? He goes on to say that you guys are spot on and calling it out, but what is the solution for mitigating its risk and maintaining use case outcomes beyond day one?
AI.
Who wants to jump in?
Yeah, I think what one of the most important things is, you know, I think we've all mentioned a few times here is having a person who's making sure that it is being managed after day one, right? I think, you know, as we're talking about budgets and CapEx and OpEx, having that person be able to help the organization balance those budgets, right? When you go put in, you know, a nice new sensor suite, are you also getting your OpEx budget to make sure that you're calibrating those sensors on some regular interval to make sure that they are still useful to whatever use case they are trying to help you solve? So I think it goes back to making sure that you have a person who has the time available to them to make sure that they continue to manage the investment that you're making into your smart building program.
Yeah, that's a good point, Seth. I mean, going back to what Trevor said earlier too, you don't want to mire that champion down in the minutia either. You don't want your champion figuring out why air handler X isn't like air handler Y, right? They should be definitely at a strategic level, able to get things done, but they're also not mired down trying to, you know, enforce standards. You should have a team of people below that champion that can take care of those kind of minutia tasks too.
But let's not blow up the you know, the people count here too bad, because
Exactly.
you know, a big chunk of this needs to be the automation. And I don't know how detailed of an answer the question asker really wanted, but let me give you just one good example of a way in which entropy can be managed at scale. If you have, say, BACnet deployments, discoveries will be your best friend. And having automation on top of that discovery to help identify new devices, changes in devices, and you know, deletion of devices, or at least devices that go offline and no longer respond, that's step kind of one. Because if you have a digital standard as well, you can do checks pretty much continuously against those systems for, you know, does this VAV have its supplier temperature sensor and its static, or not a static, but it's like its flow rate sensor and its flow set point? Like, are those available? Are the, you know, like you can ask those questions programmatically because of the protocol that you're using, with a little bit of, you know, dealing with some of the software bits in there, which a platform can help you with, or you can stand up yourself if you're sophisticated enough. But like, that's an example of one way to manage that. Anything that gets put on the corporate network, you manage through a different process that's well-defined and verifiable, right? Put these little processes in place and they add up to a lot of practical entropy management.
Yep.
Guys,
No, it's someone to own the thing
Go ahead.
and a tool to help them. Those are the big two.
There's another question that was floated out there. I've got my perspective on this. With if any of you want to throw your 2 cents in on this, feel free to. So the question is, what are the leading smart building platforms for large commercial buildings and warehouses? I'm gonna go out there and I don't want to speak for everyone on this panel, but just about everyone on this panel on the vendor side are agnostic and are going to leverage the the solution that makes the most sense for your organization. I will say that, between the large OEMs, they've all developed their own version of a smart building platform. You've got a lot of independent entities that have homegrown and built out, and then you've also got MSIs out there that have built out smart building platforms. And again, they get called all sorts of different things. At the end of the day, I don't know that there's any one or two leading smart building platforms. They've all got their pros and cons. Some do things better than others. The thing that's most critical and important is that you have a defined vision and you validate, can that vendor deliver on that vision or not? That's what matters. And there may be 5 different smart building platforms out there that'll check every single box that you have on your list, right? If they can deliver on what you need, they're a leading smart building platform as far as you are concerned. So that's my 2 cents on that. I'll open this up to the rest of the panel if they want to jump in and give their 2 cents.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Kyle. I mean, it comes down to the 2 words that people like Drew hate hearing, and that's it depends. Right? There's no one answer or one solution, I think, that fits everybody. It just kind of depends on what your vision is and what
I actually love the phrase, Joe.
Oh, do you? Sorry, didn't mean to speak for you there.
During the spring, his "Where is your boy tonight" sign behind him is actually that.
Yep. It depends.
It
It
depends.
depends.
Yeah,
I assume. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I was just gonna say, I agree, right? I don't think that there is, real smart building platforms, right? There's a lot of different software companies that are making different tools that help with different use cases, right? So it really is about identifying what are you trying to achieve, and that's going to be how you start to narrow down what are the best smart building platforms for you out there.
The hell, I mean, we're going off with a lot of non-answers to the question. I think they're looking for names, right? And
Yeah.
I feel bad because, like, I would love to name names, but I feel like I'm kind of compelled not to. But I will say this: I have 2 or 3 vendors in mind that are like top of my list. And without saying who they are, I'll tell you that the reason that I like working with them the most is because of who they have, not because of the features that they have. That is the most important thing, because I know that I can, like, if I have a deployment issue or I have something going on that I want to bounce an idea off of, they will answer the phone.
Yep.
Yeah. Find a partner you like that's
Absolutely
going to help you
critical.
realize that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a fun question. So growth in this market over the next 5 years. Okay. I'll speak to it from my perspective and then open it up. So I think, while from the landlord perspective, and I'm going to speak specifically to commercial real estate from a owner developer landlord perspective, right? As long as asset values are taking it on the chin, investment in smart building infrastructure is probably not going to be high on the list for those entities, as they're looking to ways conserve, not necessarily put in a bunch of infrastructure. And you've got a lot of assets that are going back to the bank still. I still see quite a bit of growth in the corporate real estate world, where you have owner occupier type of situations where they're investing in getting people into their office, having a top-notch environment. And then I think I would also say that when you talk about the market as far as smart building technologies, because that's a pretty broad brush to stroke with. And that's going to mean different things to different people. But I would say digital infrastructure in buildings probably not going to is going to continue to grow. I haven't looked up to see what the CAGR is for that market over the next 5 years, but I would say the developer and landlord as far as office space is going to be slower than it may be for like digital infrastructure and multifamily or some of the other asset classes. I'm going to open that up to the rest of the panel.
I think it's probably the 2 that I tend to over preach about more than anything. For the companies that are behind on the cyber element, I think we'll start to see probably more consulting services around this. I mean, your smaller kind of low to mid market who may not have a dedicated enterprise IT or cybersecurity arm internally. I think there's going to be a cautionary tale or two that there will be an intrusion, there will be a hack, there will be some sort of data exfiltration that's going to cause everybody to, you go to Census or Shodan right now, the OT and IoT search engines, last I checked, you search for BACnet, it's something north of 15,000 devices connected to the open internet, which has been that way for all of the 10 years since I started doing it. It's a little horrifying, but I think that has potential. And I think a continued push, like one of my favorite things, without mentioning names, over the last 3 years in this space is the number of players now looking to take those closed loop control signals and push them into true data points in a data lake, data warehouse, data lake house, whatever we're calling it this particular month, and really just kind of democratizing all of this operational telemetry and putting it into a place where you don't need a BMS analytics solution. Sorry to the OEM manufacturers who make cool dashboards. I would love to just give a team of data analysts. I have some on my team. We have whole teams, Elter and McKesson, to say, here's a ton of HVAC data, here's finance data, here's space data, here's badges and sensors, here's everything. Go tell me what's happening. Tell me where we should be looking, just based on pure data science, not something that's restricted to what my BMS provider gives me for historical trend analysis.
Yeah. So real quick, guys, we've got about a 5-minute warning here. So I'm going to real quick lightning round the four of you. If you could take one thing that you would leave our audience, what would that be as far as words of advice? Drew, let's continue on with you.
Single word: requirements. And I would scream it 8 times from the top of a mountain.
Joe.
Champion. Got to get that champion in place, that's going to align with your vision. And then I think more importantly is able to get things done within your organization. That's probably the most important thing of a champion, is that they need to be respected. People need to listen to them. People need to understand that what they're doing is important.
Seth.
Yeah, I'm going to echo Joe. It's all about the people, making sure that you have the people in place so that they can continue the program on into the future, and make sure that they get all the different internal teams on the same page and can deliver a successful project for what you're trying to achieve.
Trevor.
Requirements. And to an extent also roadmap, right? Like requirements come from that, but like knowing where you're going and why you're going there is huge. You would be amazed how many companies out there don't know why they're doing some of the stuff that they're doing.
Agreed. And I'll cap it off. If you don't have the people internally, there are tons of organizations out there with expertise. Don't go it alone. Find help, someone who can help you execute this strategy methodically and ensure that you're going to get the outcomes that you're asking for. So find a partner to help support you. So I'm going to cap things off. Really appreciate everyone on the panel. Thank you guys for the awesome discussion. Really appreciate each and every one of you. For those of you that are continuing to tune into additional SBX sessions, the next one's going to be at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you, audience, for tuning in and listening and learning about how you select the right smart building platform for you. Hope you got the most out of it. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a blessed day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, guys.